All right, I'm here with Jonah. This is my youngest. Jonah, do you want to tell my students who you are?
I'm Jonah Frazee.
You have to speak up so they can hear you, okay?
I'm Jonah Frazee.
Tell them about yourself.
Yeah. I go in pools and swimming.
No one understood anything you just said, so you have to say it clearly. Go ahead.
My name is Jonah Frazee. I like swimming in pools and rivers.
Yeah? Swimming in pools and rivers?
Yes.
Can you swim?
Yes.
What's your favorite part of swimming?
That I can and have fun while being in water and going underwater with my goggles.
Going underwater with your goggles. Why do you like to go underwater with your goggles?
I like to see stuff underwater.
See stuff underwater, okay. Jonah, today I'm supposed to teach my students about the brain.
Okay.
So, is there anything that you could tell them about the brain to get them started? Or help them to understand what it is?
About what brain?
The brain. Humans' brains.
So, does it hold the stuff that you know?
You gotta tell them.
So, our brain is and it can hold stuff that you know.
So Jonah, this is my youngest, Jonah. He's gonna help us start out today by telling us about the brain. So Jonah, tell my students, what is a human brain?
A brain is something it can be smaller or bigger. Right, and it has all types of different parts around the brain.
Okay. What different types of parts does it have?
The parts are like little. There's like little squiggly things on the brain.
Yeah, we call them sulci.
Called sulci.
Yep, sulci.
And there's also a back part that has a little stick-like thing.
Oh, I think you're referring to the spinal cord. It's what comes out of the brain and connects to the rest of your body.
And connects to the rest of your body.
What is a brain for?
I don't know.
Ah. What does it do?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. Well, maybe you can learn along with my students.
Okay.
So I have my brain model right here. What do you think you see about this brain model? What are some of the things that you see about it, generally?
Now there's a squiggly line.
Those squiggly lines we call sulci.
Sulci. And this these parts inside.
Ah.
And if you can crack this open.
Ah.
You see the different parts inside, and like this little wavy weed-like thing. Like some weed.
Some weed?
Like thing.
I think what you're referring to is the arbor vitae.
Oh, the arbor vitae?
Yeah, it means the tree of life in Latin. Yeah. So where does this go in someone's body? Oh, yep, it goes right up there. And what's that thing that holds your brain called? The bones around here. Sometimes you see it at Halloween or...
Skull?
Yeah, the skull. Yeah, why do you think the skull is so hard?
Because it's made of stronger material and the stuff that the shark stuff use as bone cartilage.
Yeah, it is harder than that.
Hard and solid.
Why do you think we need to have such a hard skull?
So we don't just like.
No one can see you because the camera's only recording here. Right. So
That's not. So, it doesn't break and then your skin can rip out? Oh, I mean, no. It can, and so, it protects your brain.
That's it. You figured it out. It protects your brain along with your hair and the thick skin that you have all the way around your skull.
And the bone.
They act as ways to deflect forces. If something came and hit you, then the hair and the skin on your skull and those tiny little muscles, those connective tissues, they all protect your head from jarring motions.
So it's like multiple layers on a door. Right.
Yeah, it's multiple layers around it. And then the skull has fissures. Fissures are parts where bones grow together. When you're a baby and you're born, you have a big hole in the front and probably a tiny hole in the back. And those are called fontanelles. And what happens is the skull, as the brain is getting bigger, babies' brains get bigger and bigger until they're about 2-ish. Your brain doesn't grow much from then. But by the time you're 1, what's happened is those skull bones have closed together. The hole that was in the skull was around here, the fontanelle, it's closed in. And if you have any babies at home, don't push on their soft spots, but if you just run your finger gently over the top of their skull, if it's a baby that's under, say, 6 months, you'll for sure be able to feel a little opening in the top of their skull, and that's where the bones are growing together. When they finally do grow together, they interlock like this and they create a fissure. And that fissure is a very strong structure. There's one across here, there's one back here, there's one over on the side here. And it acts as an extra strength part of your skull, almost like a helmet. And that helmet, again, acts for, when impact happens, that it distributes the vibrations across the brain. It doesn't just let that part get hit. So our brain is designed and or evolved in order to protect this precious, precious cargo. The skull helps to protect the brain. The next thing we're going to talk about, now that Henry's joined us, Henry, say hi to my students.
Hi.
Is the divisions of the brain. So Jonah, what does division mean?
I don't know.
Henry, what's division mean?
It means to, it's...
You did it. Show them. You divided the brain. A division is a section or to break apart something. Jonah's broken apart this brain model into 2 sections. The 2 major sections of the brain are called hemispheres. Have you heard that word before? Hemispheres?
I've heard
half circle.
words.
A half circle, good, a hemisphere. So when we think of a sphere, hemi is a sort of a division of that. The 2 hemispheres are the left and the right. Now you're looking at us from this direction, so you might think that that one is the left and that one's the right, but it's not. This is the left hemisphere and this is the right. Now, the 2 hemispheres, you've probably heard people are right-brained or left-brained. This is a distinction that people talk about, saying that they have a proclivity towards arts and music, or they have a proclivity towards math and science, logic, reason. People will say that they tend towards one or the other, and they'll describe themselves as right-brained or left-brained. That's a misnomer, again, kind of like the myths we talked about in the beginning of the class. No one that I know of who hasn't had what's called a hemispherectomy, this is a surgery that cuts off one half of the brain. It doesn't cut off the whole half, but it cuts off the outer part called the cortex. So none of the people that you know, unless they've had a radical resection of their brain, is right or left-brained. In fact, we are all-brained. A lot of times people will say, you only use 90% of your brain. Now, I like to ask people a question when they say that. I say, well, if you only use 10% of your brain, you don't use 90%. What 90% of your brain could I cut out and you would still be functional? That oftentimes gets them to take a second and gives them pause to think about it, because the reality is you use 100% of your brain's capacity. But the even cooler part about your brain's capacity is that it's getting better. It's one of those organs that gets better. Some cool things about your brain is that from the age when you're born, Jonah, you were born in 2013? Yeah? You were born in 2013. You're 7. Henry, you were born in 2010. Mm-hmm. So he's 9 years old. He'll be 10 this summer. That's cool, huh? You'll be 10 this summer.
Yes.
Their brains have had the same neurons, the same cells that make them up, their entire life. My 42-year-old brain is the same neurons from the day I was born until now. So what do I mean by they can get better? They can get better because neurons are in a constant state of learning. They're in a constant state of flux. They are interacting with one another, sending signals to each other, and developing connections, developing networks. We call them neural networks. And so it turns out that if you have a 42-year-old brain, those neurons have, over the last 42 years, been connecting to one another in increasingly more dynamic ways. This is the process by which your brain is involved in learning. Also, when you are born, here's a little enigma, a little conundrum, a little paradox. Let's say this is a baby's brain. Let's say this baby was born today. Wouldn't look quite like this, but let's say that this baby was born today. Its brain would contain more neurons than my brain. So interestingly, although your brain's getting more complex and more dynamic and more capable as you grow and learn, you're actually losing a specific number of neurons. Now, why we lose those neurons is a topic for another discussion, but it's a principle that you need to know. The day you're born, you have more neurons than you'll ever have. Today, you have more neurons than you'll have tomorrow. But possibly, if you've watched a lecture like this that told you something you didn't know, your neurons have become more complex and more dynamic in the way that they interact with each other. So just remember, your brain is a very precious resource, and you don't want to lose more neurons than are necessary, and you constantly want to give your neurons, your brain, more experiences that are going to allow it to expand its complexity and dynamics.
So the brain is well protected with your hard skull and your skin and your hair.
What does your hair and your skin and your skull do?
They protect your brain. And so they don't just punch it.
So you can't just get punched in the brain?
And then it could hurt.
Oh yeah.
Or your brain can fall out.
Yes, that's true. It could fall out. All right, so Henry, what is the brain?
It's a part in your body that helps you think through options or schoolwork.
Okay, so it helps you with your schoolwork. What else might it do?
Help you think through things that could possibly damage your brain to make so you could think about it and not do it.
Okay, so it helps us to not do things that might hurt ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It helps us think about options.
Helps us think through options. Good.
Almost.
All right, we've added Caleb now, so say hi to students, Caleb.
Hi.
We're talking about the brain today, and I've already asked your two younger brothers, what is this thing? So I want you to tell me now.
It's a thing that chooses decisions for you.
Exactly what I said.
It gives signals to your body to move in certain ways, and also it keeps your heart beating and makes you breathe.
Makes you breathe, keeps your heart beating, makes you move, and helps with cognition. Cognition's that big word that we use to describe as all the things the brain does other than keeping your heart beating and moving your body around.
Cognition.
Cognition. Do you know anything else about the brain you could tell the students?
No.
No. Jonah's being our cameraman now.
Also, can I say something?
You are saying something.
Okay, so, not only humans have brains, but almost a lot of other animals like cats, dogs, alligators, snakes, they have brains too. So,
What do you think the difference is? Come back here so that the students can see you. What differences do you think there are between, say, alligators, snakes, rats, birds? You got to get in the picture here. They can't see you. What do you think the differences are between the brains? What do you think those differences are between animal brains and human brains? You got to be in here.
It could be different sizes, like a cat brain could be this size.
Yeah.
of how small its head is.
Okay. So there's something about the size of the skull that indicates the size of the brain?
Yeah.
Is this the size of a human brain?
The size of your brain, if you take your two fists together, that's about the size of your cortex, or the outer layer around your brain. And if you put your hand up to your face, you can see how close... Whoosh, got you!
Don't we have the largest brain?
Wait, say it again?
Don't we have the largest brain proportional to the size of our body?
Yeah, so that's called the body mass index. The brain to the body weight is the highest in humans. Actually, strangely, there are some other animals, just because they have very low body weights, some sort of like little marsupials or something, like little tamarins or something, have a really high brain to body weight ratio, the proportion of the size of their brain to their body's weight. The other animal that's similar to humans, but not quite as much, is like dolphins. So they have a very big brain compared to their body. But again, dolphins have very large bodies. Obviously, like a giant blue whale would have a huge, huge brain, but it also has a big body that brain has to take into account. So what we're wondering is, does the size of your brain make any difference in how complex your behavior would be? And the answer to that is not really. For example, women have smaller brains than men. It's not like some politically incorrect statement I'm saying, and that's a factually, anatomically correct statement. But on average, women have higher IQs than men. So see, bigger doesn't make necessarily a more complex thing. Women's connections between their neurons look like they might be different from men's as well, right? And the more complex the connections could be, the more functional that brain is at producing really high-level cognitive skills.
Yeah.
Okay. So boys, what do you want to know about the brain from me? I'm teaching my students. What would you like to know about it?
Does it matter what type of animal it is to how much? Like a whale, would it be, if it could talk, would it be like smarter than a human?
That's a great question. So he's asking...
It would have a bigger brain than us.
Yes, it does have a bigger brain. One of the issues we have is that it's difficult to ascertain what is the experience like for other animals based on their brain size. And a lot of people have the question of what would it be like to be, say, a bat. There's a famous paper written on that. The experiences that would be if you had, say, like a bat, echolocation rather than visual cues, right? So the senses that our brain takes in and creates for us a sensory reality, it creates a system where we couldn't know what it's like. You know, our dog, I don't know where she is, but her world is based almost exclusively in the sense of smell or olfactory sense. And so her brain has a much larger olfactory bulb. Humans' olfactory bulb is pretty tiny. It's right here. See that? These are their little olfactory bulbs. Are you going to go get Luna? Okay. So humans have the experience of human sensation, but they don't have the experience of, say, what it would be like to be a blue whale or a bat. We see other animals doing similar things to humans, let's say like chimpanzees or bonobos. We see them and their activities appear to be doing things like we would do, right? They're social. Come on, come here, pups. Come on, come here. Come on, big doggy. So this big dog is really associated almost exclusively with her big sense of smell. Not really with her eyes or her ears. In fact, her ears are even designed, as we'll talk about later, to enhance her sense of smell, not her sense of hearing. And her brain is designed specifically to allow her to have the sensory experience of being a dog. Okay, good girl.
Good girl.
Go ahead. Give me a thumbs up if it's recording, buddy. All right. So Frogger, this is our cat Frogger, he has a different brain than, say, our dog. A different brain than, say, a human in our family. And the issue is, how would we know what it's like to be a cat? Or how would we know what it's like to be a dog? We can't. They don't have the ability to communicate with us through language, which is our primary means of sharing information as humans. And our brain has been developed to do that very thing. Whereas the cat's brain has not been developed or evolved or created in order for it to communicate with humans. Oh, obviously, cats can communicate with other cats and other animals, and we can have interactions, but they're not dynamic as the interactions that you and I are having with each other right now. The communication of the human brain is one of its major advances over animals that we see. Humans' ability to use language accounts for much of our ability to be different and more advanced than other species. For example, you don't see whales having AA meetings. You don't see hippos going to Costco. The reason that we're able to do these things as humans is interact with each other socially in such a dynamic and complex way is that our brain supports language. It supports our use of communications using language. And the cat is now licking my arm. When Henry asked about animals and their differences between humans, I can't tell Henry what it's like to be a blue whale. I can't tell him what it's like to be a bat. But what we can do is observe those animals' behaviors.
And observe the noises they make.
Observe their communications with one another. For example, blue whales, cetaceans, make huge, low-frequency noises that can... just like that can travel in water and communicate to other whale pods. Each of the animals that we see on Earth are specifically designed to communicate with others of the same species. Domesticated animals, specifically dogs, some interesting animal science has been done on communication and intelligence between, say, what level of intelligence animals have, and they correlate that with their brain complexity. Some researchers have looked into whether or not chimpanzees, and specifically gorillas, had similar structures in their brains as we do that support language production. And one of the researchers actually who studied gorillas at the Prospect Park Zoo, he found that they had the similar number of layers of neurons in the area of the brain called Brodmann's area that humans have that support language, and yet gorillas are vastly incapable of utilizing human language. Even those who've been trained from the time they were born for hours on end, they don't have the same capacity to do the things that humans can do, even normally developing humans. Even the best gorillas and chimps that we have don't have our ability to use language, and that is because there's massive differences in our brains.
So if Luna's keen sense of smell
Luna, our dog,
smell, and her ears enhance her smell, does Frogger have a keen sense and something that will enhance it?
Sure. So if you don't think about our cat Frogger, who's 16 years old, and you think about sort of the feral cat that lives at our house, Gato, he's always going out and finding mice and birds and eating them and leaving them as little presents for us. Now, how is he doing that? Is he smelling them? Is the sense of smell for a feline, his olfactory bulbs, are they just so keen that he can smell where the little mouse is? No, his brain is attuned to differences. And if you look at a cat's body, you'll see this cat has pinnas. This is what we call ears. Pinnas is the technical term for them, that can locate really sensitive little sounds, little vibrations. And so they're enabling the cat to be able to detect meaningful biological prey in its environment. And that's what helps the cat to seek out and do those things. So, of course, cats have great sense of smell, obviously better than humans, but I would suggest dogs have a much more profound sense of smell. And so their sensory reality, the world that their brain produces for them, is probably oriented more towards sounds, vibrations, and the sense of touch. Remember, they have whiskers that they use, and they have really good, keen sense of eyesight to see at night. Their eyes are developed to see at night.
So if selection. If you use selection, like a really smart
He's licking my arm
person,
again. The cat's licking my arm
If
again.
you took a really smart cat and another really smart cat, would the genes pass on into the brain, or would the brain be the same as a normal cat and not have been affected by the selection?
Okay, so Henry's asking about genetic inheritance and whether or not if we artificially selected for, that's the term you use when you pick the cat you want to have a baby with another cat, that's called artificial selection. Not natural selection, where the cats would just be out and they would have babies with each other whenever they wanted. But artificial selection would be that we picked the smartest cat that we had and the next smartest cat that we had that were a boy and a girl, and they would have a litter of little kittens. It would be so adorable. The question is, would they be smarter? Or is there a gene that's making their brain develop in a different way? Okay, so you have 23 different pairs of chromosomes.
Yeah.
And along those chromosomes are little sort of written out instructions for how to make all the different cells in your brain, whether it be your hair, whether it be your skin, whether it be your heart or your liver or your kidneys or your bones or your eyes or your ears. There's a little different part, an instruction manual for your body to produce different proteins. And there are parts of your genes that code for specific development in the brain. It's thought that some elements of the sixth pair has, the sixth chromosome has a really important part for brain development. So there's some indications that certain genes are much more important than others. The 23rd chromosome, so 23, that's the one that has an XX if you're a genetic female or an XY if you're a genetic male. And there are some sex differences between brains, as I've previously said. Right? A larger brain is going to be in males and a smaller brain is females, but not just that. There are some distinguishing features. This part in the side is called the Sylvian fissure or lateral fissure. And that side has a different trajectory in males and in females. Gray matter and white matter. So gray matter is the outside, sort of the cell bodies. We'll talk about neurons in a bit. And then white matter is the connective tissues, the communication wires, if you will, the USB lines of the brain. So there are genes that matter. In fact, if you artificially selected for smarter cats, you would get smarter and smarter cats. And we've done that. In fact, artificial selection we've done with all sorts of domestic animals, and we get the type of animal we want. Now, I don't think there's a lot of people out there that are selecting for the smartest cat. It's not really what we want from them. We don't need them to do really cognitively complex things. We need them to purr and to let us pet them and to cuddle with us and to be cute and to annoy us for food all the time. We don't really need them to be solving the major world's problems.
So if you took a really big dog and a really big dog,
that's how we get really, really big dogs.
So you can make Clifford the Big Red Dog?
No, Clifford is a cartoon, so you would have to draw him. Okay.
Exactly how old he is, but he's definitely, and also, what in the world did you get back here? Kyle, my snail is right here. Here. I don't know what a snail's brain is like, or a fish's brain. And so, I don't even know one single bit of a snail's brain, but a baby snail's brain is about as tiny as
So Jonah, what you could do if you wanted to know
this.
About a snail's brain, how could you learn about it?
I don't know. But
Well, how do you know about anybody's brain?
well, I know a little about Frogger's brain.
But how do you know what their brains do?
So I can see that he loves scratches on the chin because he gets so happy and relaxed. And also, I know
So you
about
see his
brain that he loves-
behavior.
What?
You see from his behaviors what he does, that's all produced by his brain.
Yes. So his brain makes his decisions.
His brain makes decisions, and we can understand about animals' behavior based on, or we can understand about animals' brains based on their behavior. All right, so now I'm going to talk more about neuroscience and how it got started. If we get lucky, there are some tiny little birds right up there, and they're fledging right now. They're little house finches that we've watched feeding their babies for some time now and building that nest. But back to the brain. So the brain is comprised of a bunch of neurons and glial cells. Those are tiny, tiny little specialized neurons, and you got 100 billion of them. But first, a history lesson about how we figured this out. When people were understanding how the brain functioned, initially they didn't have the ability to look at neuroanatomy at a microscopic level, and they didn't really understand the principles by which the neurons worked. So they had to look at pathology, and that was whenever they would find an injured soldier or somebody got hit in the head with a big rock, or I don't know, something that people experienced back in the day like a fight. What they might notice is that brain injuries led to behavioral changes, and so that was the first connection, really, was through injuries. They didn't understand necessarily the structure and function of the brain yet, but they understood that when you got hit in the head, sometimes you weren't right. You couldn't use language, or you would forget things, or you were disoriented. People did understand that about injuries, and so they began to build up a case study histories of people who had experienced different types of traumatic brain injuries. One of the famous people that we talk about is Phineas Gage, and we'll get to him when we do the structure of the frontal lobe. But the history of studying the brain really came about after World War I. Now, some of that histology, or the study of the cells of the brain, had a different path. So we'll talk about that. Initially, people discovered how to use microscopes to look at microscopic things, tiny, tiny little cells in our body, in like the early 1600s. I mean, it was something ridiculously a long time ago, and those were immigrants to the Netherlands, but the Dutch claim the invention of the microscope, so that's cool. We give that to the Dutch. But then what happened wasn't until Golgi figured out how to stain a neuron, because you couldn't really see it under a microscope unless you defined its edges, and that's what Golgi, who was an Italian physiologist, figured out how to do. He figured out how to stain the perfect outline, or the cell body of a neuron, so you could see its shape, and this was a revolution. At the time, however, they didn't really understand how those neurons fit together, and it wasn't until a man, Spanish origin, so now we've got the Dutch immigrants, immigrants to the Netherlands, the Italians and Golgi, and now Ramon Santiago y Cajal figured out something really cool about it. He figured out that there were spaces in between these neurons. The spaces, what we call synapses. He figured out that all those neurons don't touch one another, but there are gaps. They're distinctive cells. And then finally, the German Waldmeyer comes along, and he basically says, Waldeyer comes along, and he says, well, I've looked at some of the stuff from this Swiss guy, Hiss, and from this other German guy, Farrell, and he coagulates all of that research into the neuron doctrine, and he actually names a neuron. So what is a neuron? So a neuron is the basic unit of the brain. Now, it gets far too much play in my consideration. I really love glial cells, which I'll give you an analogy for here in a second. But a neuron is the individual cells that comprise the brain. You got about 100 billion of them. So 100 billion neurons are all over your body, and those neurons are unique. Now, how are they unique? So neurons are unique in several ways. One of the ways that they're unique is their shape. They're distinctive from other cells in our body. Other cells in our body have amorphous forms, and they don't necessarily have distinctive shapes, whereas the neurons have these really incredible shapes that we'll talk about when we study the anatomy of a neuron. And there's many different types. Different types of neurons have different shapes that distinguish them and their function. Another thing you can distinguish them by is their function. Now, their function is that they communicate. There are other cells in our body that communicate. For example, our endocrine system, which is our glands, our thyroid, our pituitary, pineal gland, lymphs, all this stuff sort of secrete hormones. And they secrete hormones, and those hormones wash over large areas of tissue and influence large areas of tissue over a longer period of time. But neurons are unique in their function in that their communication is happening at an incredibly fast pace, and it's happening from one cell to the next. Now, it's not that simplistic, but for the sake of understanding the basics of how neurons communicate, we'll say that one cell communicates to the next cell, and then that cell communicates to the next cell in a line that we call neural networks. It is much more complicated than that, and we're learning more and more about the dynamics of that as people study the basics of neurohistology and neurofunctioning. But their function is different from other cells in the body. So they're the cells that communicate. So they're distinctive in shape. Their shape is different. They're distinctive in their function. They communicate. And finally, I think probably the most interesting thing about a neuron, or its unique quality of a neuron is that those neurons that you have now, as I referred to before with my boys when I told you about how their neurons had been there since they were born, and my neurons have been there since I was born, is a neuron's longevity. So a neuron is the only cell in your body that doesn't die until you do. In fact, there are neurons that you have the day you're born, and they're going to be there the day you die. This is unique because if you're looking, let's say if you're looking, people look at my beard, they're like, oh, how long have you been growing your beard? My beard grows slowly, but I mean, it hasn't been that long. I haven't been able to grow a beard for more than like 12 years. So at maximum, those cells, which are dead, they're dead cells, those are 12 years old. When you look at people's skin, which is what most of us look at when we're looking at another human being, you know how long the cells on my skin have been there? These actual cells, the ones you're actually looking at, the ones here on my hand, on my arm, these cells have only been there, on average, if you average out cellular age of the skin cells, you'll find that they're about 14 days old. 14 days old is really pretty young. I'm 42 years old as a person, but all my cells are newer than that. The only cells that are as old as I am are the ones up here. And that's a unique function, the longevity of those neurons. Again, you get 100 billion, and as I said previously, you lose neurons every day. So you're always going to have less and less neurons. Then you might think, well, how is it that people get smarter and smarter as they age? Which they do. People get better and better at understanding and synthesizing and using their brain's capacity, and yet they lose neurons. Sort of a less is more hypothesis. Well, that's a simplistic understanding of it. And you lose cells from doing stupid things like playing football and hitting your head a bunch of times, or doing a bunch of drugs, right? Or not sleeping enough. Not getting enough sleep will kill your neurons. Stress, we found out stress through some amazing researchers' work on hormones' effects on neurodegeneration, that of Sapolsky. You'll see videos of him later in this course. Stress can break down the cellular structure of a neuron and kill neurons. Remember, you don't get new ones. Again, you do. Nothing is as simple as I'll tell you. But for the most part, you can't get new neurons. There's a couple exceptions. You get some that help you smell new things, and you get some that help you remember new things. But not at the rate at which you're losing them. So you're always going to be losing neurons. That is, you should be protecting your neurons, making sure you don't get your head hit, making sure that you don't do things that injure your brain in ways that are irreparable. And we'll talk about neuroplasticity in a bit, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer, and people don't understand necessarily what that means. All right, in the late 1700s, a couple of guys started to try and figure out how the brain worked. One of them was Pierre Frazee, and he was in France. Another one was Francis Gall. And these two men get pilloried a lot. But I don't think we should be so harsh on them, despite the fact that what they did was wrong, and it didn't necessarily give us the answers that they were looking for. But they set us on a course of discovery about brain functioning that was really important. So what did Frazee and Gall do? Well, Frazee did investigations into animal behavior and the connection between the brain and animals' behavior by cutting out pieces of animals' brains and then saying, what can the animal do? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you now about Pierre Frazee and Francis Gall, two men who contributed greatly to neuroscience. They both lived in the late 1700s to early 1800s. Pierre Frazee used a technique called ablation, which ablation is basically cutting out parts of the brain. So he would take an animal, and he would cut out a part of the brain and see, well, what does that animal do now? And he would assume that if the animal lost some capability, that was a result of losing that part of the brain. This is really good thought and good research. Unfortunately, you got to chop up a bunch of baby animal brains and see how they don't develop to figure this out. So he sometimes gets pilloried as not necessarily the greatest neuroscientist, but I appreciate the thought and the contribution to science of Pierre Frazee. The other man who gets oftentimes pilloried by news media and the public in general is Francis Gall. Now, Francis Gall did investigations into the bumps on top of your head. And he basically suggested that the bumps on your head or your skull corresponded to underlying neural tissue. And therefore, what he could do is sort of read the type of person somebody was by checking the bumps on their skull and saying that that meant that they had underlying brain tissue that was of a certain capability. And so he made these maps, these phrenology maps. You may have seen them. Phrenology is also a really good album by The Roots, if you want to go get that. But aside from that, he was investigating a connection between neuroanatomy and human behavior. And so that's why I think Francis Gall doesn't get quite the credit he deserves, is that he was trying to figure out this. Now, he didn't have the benefit of the microscope, and he didn't have the benefit of the Golgi stain or the understanding of the neuron hypothesis that was developed later. But he did investigations nonetheless, and I want to encourage you. We don't know about the brain yet. We don't have the answers to how the brain produces consciousness, and yet you're sitting here today able to think critically, able to develop an expertise in science and neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and neuropsychology, and figure out things that we don't know quite yet. So I want to encourage you. We don't know everything about the brain. We really don't. And you might be one of those people who eventually leads us to more understanding than we currently have. So don't be discouraged by all the complexities involved with this. Be encouraged by people in the past didn't have the tools we have, and they were able to come up with some really important things too. So you should understand that your contribution is to think critically about something and develop new ideas that challenge the sort of standard party line about neuroscience. And I think you guys might be the ones to do it.